So if you're watching here in the audience or at home or from your desk in a cubicle somewhere, you can join in the conversation. Hit us up on Twitter and just send your questions using the hashtag WPCyber. It sounds like a Cyber Monday discount, but actually it'll send the questions up here so we can make you part of the conversation. So that's hashtag WPCyber. I want to continue this morning's conversation with a really scary but important set of questions, and that is, how do you prevent a cyber attack? And how do you know if you've already been breached? So I've got two smart guests here to help us figure that out. First of all, Sam Curry is the Chief Product Officer and Security Officer at the firm Cyberreason, and he has over 25 years in IT security experience. And then over on the other side, we have Rob Knake. He's a Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and previously spent years as the Director of Cybersecurity Policy at the NSC for the Obama administration. Hope I got that right. So let's dive right in with this. Okay, so we have this Hollywood image of how a breach happens. It's like a guy in a hoodie. He's probably somewhere in Eastern Europe, and he wants your good stuff. What's wrong with that image versus reality? How does this really happen?
I'll maybe kick it off, and then maybe Rob will say something. I think the first image is, while they may identify with the image, they're not sitting around wearing hoodies. They're not necessarily lone wolves. In fact, most of the time, not necessarily a guy either, all walks of life, and they tend to be very organized. If anything, they look like we do. They look like companies. They look like very agile organizations. They're well-funded. They have HR departments. They have all sorts of functions. So that image of, especially in the movies, is usually somebody with a funny accent who starts typing and hits enter and says, "We're done." Very flashy. While there may be many of those, or folks who wear the trappings, that's not what they're about. They're very motivated, very dedicated, and organized.
What do you think, Sam?
So I think that the really bad news here is how you find out that you've been breached is usually not because you've got a crack IT security team that's discovered it. Most breaches are discovered by third parties. You find out when law enforcement tells you. You find out when your credit card number gets used by a third party. You find out when your bank accounts have been drained. So it's not usually because you've detected the adversary on your network and have been able to contain them. That's obviously where most companies would like to get if they can't stop the breach from happening in the first place. But for the most part right now, we are in catch-up and response mode on cybersecurity.
I was going to say, it's worth unpeeling what a breach is a bit. We tend to use the word to mean many things, but there's a big difference between an infrastructure breach and either an information breach or abusive access. These things are slow. The attacks tend to move at a rate, at the best in the world, move at about 4 to 5 systems a day. As they escalate privilege, shift systems, move laterally, scan. The goal is to go deeper, understand a network, and usually then be able to exploit it. But there's time in there. And to Rob's point, it's really hard to know if you've been breached. And there seems to be an impression that, not infrastructure breach so much, but the more serious, once it's been developed and actually used, the question is often, how has something bad happened and what does it look like? Because even when the external authorities find out, it's usually some telemetry is given about development of access by the bad guys. The adversaries they know are in the networks, but there's a fog of war that applies. And so as you start to investigate it and you start to act on the system, you actually affect their behavior. It's a lot like submarine warfare. They'll go dormant, they'll go silent. And then the question is, what's the fact base? Have they got something? Don't they have something? How do you get control of the network again? It's worth unpacking that to some degree.
So what do companies and organizations do wrong on these questions? Like what do you see the most common mistakes are? They think, hey, we take security seriously here at Bank XYZ, but what are they really doing wrong?
So there's an awful lot of companies out there and organizations. So for those who may be watching or listening, realize that it's very hard to generalize. But the majority, they treat security as a set of checklist items. They think of it as a box that they can stick in a rack or a product that they can buy and it will just take care of it, and they want that. I had
Who wouldn't want that? I mean,
exactly.
That's how organizations work.
I had a chief information security officer tell me once, I would like a 1U rack mountable security solution I don't have to think about. Tell me the price for that. And I said, I would like one to end world hunger, and I would like one that stops cancer as well. But the difficult thing to realize is, the analogy I think I used with you the other day was, it's like health. I'd love a pill that just made you healthy, but it takes exercise and it takes eating well. And the equivalent in security is, you've got to do the checklist right, but you're going to have to learn how to get healthy. You're going to have people who live to stop bad guys, who have the right tools at their disposal to find a human opponent. It's the only thing in IT where the adversary is human. In other words, we haven't yet solved the Turing challenge. There is no AI, in spite of all the marketing, that is just going to be like HAL 9000 and find it for you. We have to use people, and we have to use them very effectively and build their skills and have them at the sharp end fighting this. That's the biggest mistake I see.
So organizations have to eat right and exercise?
Yeah.
What do you think? What are people doing wrong?
Yeah, I mean, so if you take it from a basic level on up, right? Most breaches in this country, if you look at the data coming out of something like Verizon's data breach report, where every year they collect the data on how breaches happened, 85% of them are due to the most basic hygiene issue, weak passwords or stolen credentials, right? So you've got to do the basics right? What are the basics in this case? Well, rotate passwords. Better yet, start replacing passwords or going to multi-factor authentication. Most companies aren't doing that. Hence, 85% of breaches happen when somebody steals credentials. Then from there, you look and the next set of breaches are due to vulnerabilities that are already known. So this is kind of basic hygiene that Sam's talking about. Unfortunately, if you do those two things right, then you get into the next world that targets US government agencies and major corporations, where you're doing spear phishing attacks, targeted attacks to try and compromise an individual account, to try and get them to click on a link, download malware, take over the host, and then go through that escalation process that Sam was talking about. If you want to stop that, you need skilled analysts, you need the ability to hunt within your network, you need the ability to bring in large amounts of outside information. It is no easy or simple task. I think the good news is, though, it is possible. There's a lot of nihilism in cybersecurity, and yet there are companies who are effectively able to manage this problem day after day, month after month, year after year. What we need to see is the spreading of these kinds of capabilities from a small number of government agencies, a small number of defense contractors, a small number of IT companies and banks, down to the rest of the economy.
How much is it going to cost? How much does an organization need to spend on cybersecurity to live up to your vision?
So I was at a company that had a breach, and we spent $125 million in the year of the breach as a write-down, which is atrocious, right? And I remember saying to some folks that we had doubled our spend post-breach. But frankly, the way you spend it matters more than what you spend. My belief is that good operations, good execution, good management discipline over security, and by that I mean really focusing on the things that have the highest risk, is the most important. So rather than just say, hey, we spent $5 million last year and now we're spending 10, that must be twice as good. I think it's better to talk about what you're spending it on, what the mission is, how you're focusing, how you're doing triage. Whether you're in the government or in the private sector, the way you spend money actually matters more than how much. And typical, by the way, is about 7 or 8% of IT is spent on security. But I've seen it spent terribly, and I've seen it spent very well.
Would you put a number on it?
Well, I would say that if you look globally at IT spending versus IT security spending, the global number is about 2%.
Whoa.
So a lot of catching up to do to get to Sam's number of 6 to 8%. I've seen some organizations that are spending upwards of 20% of their IT budgets on cybersecurity, but they're spending it for long-term capital investments to create secure networks, to create secure architectures, to migrate away from legacy systems. That's very expensive. It's also, I think, ultimately what many companies need to do to make themselves secure.
So if you're a CEO or a member of a board, you're probably aware that cybersecurity is an issue, but how do you know if you're getting enough or the right kind of information from your people to know, to measure whether you're doing enough? Is there a metric that people should be looking for? I mean, aren't organizations kind of under perpetual attack now. So you don't want to, get a call every time.
That's an excellent question. Probably the biggest problem in security, I think, in general, is this lack of alignment between the security discipline and the business. So if you're a chief information security officer or whoever sits at the top of the security chain, you on the one hand have to be deeply rooted in the technology, which is very esoteric. It's very, this is not something you talk at the C-level. If you get on an elevator with the CEO, you should not be talking about how many viruses you stopped or the latest exploit. Like that's not interesting to them, right? Instead, the alignment of the CISO to what the business cares about is their biggest source of alienation. CISOs don't last in their position generally more than about 12 or 13 months because they're not perceived to be true C-level in many cases. So and my advice to CISOs is there's only really 3 or 4 things you should be talking about at the C-level, and you're the translation between the security department and risk for the business. And by that I mean legal risk, operational risk, basically all the other forms of risk in the organization. So you should be talking about revenue and cost and margin, right? So what is the impact to the business, or risk reduction in a risk language that's common to everyone. Or you should be talking about customer satisfaction or employee efficiency is the third one. Or finally, how you align to a strategic initiative. Everything out of your mouth has to be about that. And you've got to stop thinking of yourself as defending what you do in security from the rest of the business, and instead showing that you really understand a core business or a mission in the case of the government.
Is there any other metric that you think folks should be looking?
Well, I mean, I think the way I've seen some companies break it down effectively is they look at your standard inputs, outputs, outcomes metrics. And so if you treat your inputs as your money, your people, what you're doing on your contractual side, how many technologies you're onboarding, okay, that may be useful to a C-level executive. They're going to understand that kind of thinking. Then your outputs, you want to start looking at what's the state of your cybersecurity hygiene and how you can measure that in a quantifiable way continuously, right? So it's not reporting on the latest checklist that was done a year ago, but you're actually in real time able to provide data on the state of your network and its security. And then I think the outcome question is a really difficult one for many companies to answer. I think, in my view, the companies that do this the best, what they can say is we're tracking our adversaries. We know when we're being targeted. We know where in the kill chain, what stage in the attack we were able to stop them at, and to be able to tell their senior leadership, we kept them from getting anywhere near our crown assets, our critical assets. And if you can do that, you can show your effectiveness. You can also make the case repeatedly that you need more inputs, more money, and more people, because they may not have been stopped at the first or second opportunity.
This is a problem, though, because if you're a CEO and you're sitting there saying, you've already got 30 people in the department, and you're saying you need more money, CEOs know 2 things, right? Technical departments always want more people, and marketing always wants more money. They know that. How do they make the trade-off with who gets the next 100K or 200K? Right. And so the best metrics are, as you say, the ones that show the efficiency of the department and the true numbers in terms of the risk avoidance. Now, right now, we've seen a flash of stuff that is very low level, but very, very public. Things like ransomware and destructionware that grab the headlines. I'll tell you what, I've been a CISO now 4 times. And in one of my CISO stints, I knew something more nefarious was happening and to go look for it because we had a DDoS attack or ransomware outbreak. In other words, the bad guys would use this as a form of distraction and bury in noise to signal ratio the actual thing they were doing. Right. So rather than say, hey, we all collaborated, we shunted that DDoS off to one side, or we prevented a massive logic bomb in our environment on one occasion where somebody detonated a very destructive thing to go after the data in our data centers. I said, okay, congratulations, but now what's in the noise? Like what is buried in there that this was a cover for? And that's sometimes harder to quantify because you can actually measure the impact of an averted piece of ransomware. But it's hard to, if you don't know the denominator, you just know the numerator. We caught this number of advanced attacks. What ratio does that represent or what risk was averted? That's harder to measure sometimes.
What did Equifax do wrong? Whoever wants to take that.
That's a horrible question, but...
we only have 15 minutes left, so choose.
Yeah, well, I'll dive on it, and then maybe Rob will think of something in that time. But the first thing is that I very rarely see the media get it right. I think Equifax has a whole lot of issues wrapped up in how it handled the issue as opposed to what actually happened. And one of the worst things you can do is, if you weren't there, play that Monday morning armchair quarterback. I believe the truth comes out over time in these things. I think they probably sat on it far too long. I don't think they took it seriously high up in the organization. And I think by and large, I think one of the biggest issues that we have with Equifax is it's hard to see who the customer is and what the privileged information they contain is and how they respect it. There's a lot of privacy legislation coming out now. In Europe, we have GDPR about to come out that says that you don't have a right to this data. It's privileged data, and you need to treat it as such. And our own privacy legislations are evolving as well here in the United States. But I think the biggest thing was they took too long and they didn't treat it as a crisis seriously enough, soon enough. I think internal processes will come to light. Did they do the right things? It's hard to say from the outside.
I think my answer is what they did wrong is they didn't value the data sufficiently. If they had understood the societal cost, not the cost of the company, but the societal costs of losing that data, they never would have lost it, right?
But this is their whole business, though, right? I mean, how could they not know the value of it?
They knew the value of it to them. Look, the biggest risk in having the Equifax breach isn't that I might have my identity stolen immediately. It's the cost of data on everyone just went down. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge I see here is they still have the data. We say it was stolen, but they still have it. They're still in operation. They're still, from a certain perspective, they are fully resilient to this cyber attack because they can keep doing what they're doing, right? The problem is, unlike in other areas, we didn't say to them, look, you're going to have to make every American whole for this, which would easily put them out of business, right? If they had understood that that was going to be the level of consequence, they would have made sure it never happened. And that's what we're missing.
And that would have required different legislation.
That would have required different legislation. The analogy I use is this is the way we treat oil spills. We say to an oil tanker coming into U.S. waters, if a drop of oil lands in the ocean, you're responsible for the full cost of cleanup and remediation, and you need to prove that you have those financial resources at your disposal. If we had that same kind of setup for a data leak, you guarantee that a company like Equifax would be saying, okay, we need an insurance policy that nobody would write because we don't have the ability to prove that we have security in place so that they're not going to have uncontained losses. That's what we need to address problems like Equifax. It's not actually the technical controls. Those will need to evolve over time.
So Equifax was a data leak, as you called it. But Rob, if you were a CISO or a CIO or even a CEO, what would keep you up at night right now? What ought to be keeping you up at night?
So I think last spring within the cybersecurity community, a lot of fear had shifted from I'm going to lose my data to I'm going to have my data destroyed. There was a series of ransomware attacks or really destructive attacks that had quite widespread impact on global companies. And for many of these, they weren't targeted attacks. It was a problem of contagion. And so I think that's where I think the fear should be right now. It's, oh my goodness, I've been so worried about somebody stealing my data, and I've been thinking that my critical assets are my data, when my critical assets may be the IT systems that allow my company to function at a basic level.
Do you agree?
No, I don't. But that's okay. I think that's a very good point. But you did ask what the thing that would keep them up at night is, and as a CISO, very few things keep us up at night. Right? We live in a constant state of concern, and no human being can do that. Right? So
you don't sleep anymore? Or?
No, I have children. Right? So so they keep me up at night. But the biggest single concern is how to drive what we know we need to do in security to be taken seriously by the business. I'll give you an example in the IT security domain. Right? The sort of low-level hygiene functions. The patches that need to be deployed to stop a lot of this ransomware and destruction, where we know what they are. It's not like G.I. Joe where knowing is half the battle, right? It's not like that. We know. The problem is that there's an accumulated tech debt every time you touch IT. And that impacts people's tickets, and that impacts time to resolution for tickets. And those are key metrics monitored by the business. So here you are as a CISO, and you go, hey, we've got, 100 severe, tickets that we have to patch. And if I patch all 100, I guarantee something will break. I guarantee it. And on top of that, I guarantee there'll be an interruption to the business. You'll lose your 5 nines. So what does the CIO say? They say, well, pick 5, pick 10. So you pick your 10, and guess what? Because you patch them, they never become an issue. So you've become the person who's always screaming and saying, I need to patch these things. If, on the one hand, one of the ones you didn't patch happens to get exploited, you're out of a job, right? And so the question is, how do you get a full seat at the table so you can do what you know needs doing and know how to translate that? And that is the hardest thing. So CISOs that are sitting there, they go, okay, I'm now going to do some triage and build some relationships so that I can get some things done that I know need doing. But in the end, I can't get them all done. And that leads to long-term anxiety, right? Some CISOs ask themselves, why do I even do this job? But
this
as for
last a year in the job?
That's why. I mean, I met with one CISO a decade ago now and said, hey, how's your data? He said, great. I said, how's your security? He said, awful. I said, well, do you want to fix it? I've worked for a number of vendors, and we sell software that does that. He goes, no. He says, the life expectancy for me at the time, he said, is about 18 months in this job. He said, if I'm not already succeeding in 9 months, I'm really just cushioning things for my successor. I'll take all the heat to buy your solution and deploy it, and let's assume it works. He said, and then the pressure is on me to actually deliver something, and I'm just going to sit here and wait, spending a lot of money with no results. It was proving a negative. That's the hardest thing, but I don't think it keeps them up at night, right?
So Rob, let's say you just discovered that your organization has had a pretty critical part of its infrastructure taken over by ransomware, and you attack, and you have to decide, what do you do? What do you do next? Do you pay the ransomware? Do you call the FBI?
So I'm a policy guy, so I'm going to give a policy answer. You should never pay ransoms. You pay ransoms, you are exacerbating the problem for the rest of the community, right? So you're funding criminals who are going to take that money and they're going to spend a lot of it on Lamborghinis and leather jackets if they're in Ukraine. They're going to take the rest of that and they're going to hire more people and develop new tools, and they're going to come back at us 3 or 4 times harder. So from a policy perspective, I would say don't pay a ransom. I think it should be illegal to pay a ransom. If you are a CISO or you are further up the chain, if you're the CEO of a company, you're most likely going to pay the ransom. If you believe if there's any evidence that paying the ransom will get your data back. That's what most companies are doing in response to it. If you're dealing with these kinds of attacks and you haven't put in place the prevention mechanisms to have a more secure network, there's very little you can do after the fact. You can't go back in time and solve that problem.
That's why you want to pay the ransomware. Yeah. Do you agree?
Look, it's a risk-based decision for everybody in the spot. It really is. And the job of a CEO is not public safety. It's not. The job of a CEO is to protect the shareholders, and it's to do right by the employees, and it's to follow the mission of whatever their company is. If you're a hospital and you've just been nailed and people are going to die if you don't have data, what do? Right? This is not an easy answer that I think that we should, with all due respect, I don't think we should be talking about making it illegal yet. I think it's on us as an industry to make sure that the right measures are in place beforehand to get backups and recovery up quickly, to be able to say, I actually am more resilient to ransomware. Make sure that happens. Make sure that you have the ability to survive an attack and continue critical operations. But for us to blanket say that it's going to be illegal is a horrendous thing. It is a tough risk-based decision. Now, I think we've got to hit them economically, these attackers. There should be less Lamborghinis bought illicitly in all parts of the world. But honestly, I don't think that we can say quite that it is. I think we should say, if you can, don't. It is there'll be inspection of why you did. There'll be inquiries into it, and you shouldn't be damaging the public safety. But it is a risk-based decision for that organization. They may go out of business, and people may die in some businesses, and that's a tough call to make.
Do you want to argue with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimate answer is if you continue to take an approach where you don't have to invest in cybersecurity, where it's not a core fundamental part of your business, because of those kinds of outcomes, those bad outcomes that can come from these attacks, then you're never going to make those investments in cybersecurity, right? And so if what we need to do is create a level playing field in which companies say, we've got to make these investments, we don't have a choice, they will make those. Absent that, it will always look like the right answer from a bottom line perspective to say, if we can pay a ransom at $20,000, why put $6 million into our cybersecurity? And I think that's...
I don't think that trade-off's happening, though. Look, your point earlier was quite valid, that many of these attacks take the path of least resistance, and that's too easy right now. But even if we raise the bar on it, these attacks will still happen. It's not like anybody's going to have perfect security just with a checklist mentality and say, okay, now I've done enough. You can spend a lot of money and still get hit. So I'm just very leery of anything that is a blanket policy like that. And the one thing I'll say is, as a company, you have to think about not just the actual damage, but also how you will weather it. Companies can't be victims. They can be heroes or they can be villains. And when they do their crisis management and when they think about how things will be, how the wounded will be bayoneted after the incident, they have to keep that in mind. And so do it right beforehand. But in that moment, I believe it's a risk-based decision. And we should, by all means, put pressure on them to not pay it. But just blanket make it illegal is very concerning.
Say we turned your tech discussion into a policy discussion.
And by the way, I'm a techie, so yeah.
Oh, I love it.
Apologies.
We're getting some questions here from Twitter, so let's
Sure.
let's talk with about a couple of them. David on Twitter asks, "What are the new ways hackers and others are finding to monetize stolen data? What are they doing with it?"
Well, a lot of them are tying into already existing organized crime's way of monetizing things. There's perfectly good or perfectly bad ecosystems for how to take stolen goods and data and turn them into things. And so organized crime is angling in, and in fact, we're seeing nation states start to use this to generate cash and credit. North Korea is a good example, right? They have got sanctions and embargoes, and they've gone after places like Bangladesh and Taiwan in order to get cold, hard currency. So
how are they doing that exactly? Can you sort of...
Oh, I don't. In the case of North Korea, it is moving it through, especially external to North Korea, systems and ways. There's a ratio of how much you can steal electronically and how to get the hard cash out at the end, or turn it into something that you can use. But very complex ecosystems that are very hard to trace, especially international ones. And to answer David's question, they're using tried and true money laundering and organized crime mechanisms.
Any other new techniques you've been tracking?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we see is, right, it's you steal the data, you take the data, you use it to commit fraud, right? And so if it's tax fraud or it's insurance fraud, it's pretty basic, right? If I have stolen your name, your social security number, your date of birth, and other information like that, I can pretend to be you with the IRS. I have everything I need to get your last year's tax return. I take that tax return, I take the information from that, I use it to file a refund tax form, so I get a refund. I have the refund sent to me, sent to my bank account. Then you go and you apply for your refund, and the IRS says, "Oh wait, we've already received your return for this year." So I mean, it's that kind of play over and over again. It's why this information is valuable. The solution that I think a lot of people are looking at now is to say, okay, we may not be able to protect all this data. It's in so many places. It's out there. You know, if you had a security clearance, like a lot of people in this town did, anytime in the last 25 years, everything about you is gone, right? So the solution here isn't to say, okay, we need to stop all these future data breaches. We need to change the systems so this kind of data is not valuable, so it can't be used to reset passwords. It can't be used to gain account access. It can't be used to open up new accounts.
We're almost out of time, but if you've got questions, get them in now. Hashtag WPCyber on Twitter. We've got another one, a question from Erica on Twitter. Are we spending too much time and resources on cyber prevention rather than cyber law enforcement?
I'm used to the question of cyber prevention rather than detection and more advanced means of stopping stuff. I'm not used to the contrast with law enforcement, so I'm assuming she means after the fact in some way, or making it more of a détente to do it in the first place, more disincentive. I don't think they come from the same budgets by and large. I think within IT, there's a lionizing of detection, prevention rather, and we need more abilities to detect what has slipped past because of intelligent opponents, as we discussed earlier. But on the law enforcement angle, Rob, do you have a...
Yeah, I mean, I think there used to be this question of can we do attribution, can we find the attackers? And I think the answer now is, yeah, we've gotten pretty good at that. The problem is you trace the attackers and they are in China and they are in Russia and they are in countries that have no interest in aiding the investigation, arresting people and extraditing them to the United States. And so I think more resources for law enforcement would be useful, but there's going to be many of these attacks that are going to be carried out from places where we're just not going to be able to get law enforcement actions to happen.
Got it. Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you, Sam and Rob, for that discussion. We'll continue the argument backstage about paying for ransomware. And now we'll move on to the next section of our program. Thanks.